In the 19th century, Smyrna was the place where East and West met in the most spectacular fashion. It was a cosmopolitan and happy city where Turks, Greeks, Armenians and Levantines lived together, and voices from every language could be heard. But the rising winds of nationalism and war transformed this climate of tolerance into a bloody reckoning. Following years of occupation, the entry of the Turkish army in September 1922 marked the end of an era. The Great Fire that followed consumed not just homes but a centuries-old culture. Amidst the tragedy of hundreds of thousands trapped on the quayside and the rising flames, the old multicultural Smyrna was buried in history. As a new republic rose from its ashes.
The 19th century Mediterranean world was dominated by cosmopolitanism. This was the time of extensive east-west commerce that went through the Mediterranean, and the points of contact between the east and the west were several large commercial cities which enacted the trade.
Into the city, giving it a unique and quite amazing cosmopolitan character. The principal nationality here were the Greeks, but there were also numerous Turks, Armenians, Jews, Europeans of every nationality had come to set up home here. And then the Americans had come at the beginning of the 20th century as well. The American consul George Horton said that in no city in the world did East and West meet in so spectacular a fashion. It really was a unique and very, very cosmopolitan, tolerant city. There's a wonderful account by a French journalist who steps ashore one summer's day onto the quayside of Smyrna, and he's amazed because within the first few minutes of landing, he's heard virtually every language under the sun and met all these different nationalities. Then he begins to walk down the quayside and he describes seeing all these people in their different national costumes, which is quite amazing. Armenians in their long robes and their hats, Turks in their fezzes, there's British in their top hats and bowlers.
When I'm asked where I come from, Smyrna puts a smile on my face because it was a happy city, despite all the difficulties and the problems. Smyrna was a place where people had fun, worked hard and played hard. They had the sea, they had the farms, they had the produce.
And was governed according to the rules of the empire. The Muslims were first-class citizens, and the non-Muslims were second-class citizens. However, they were given some rights. The first was immunity from local legislation.
It was Frank Street. Now this was the principal street in the city, and this is where all the wealthiest shops were, where the department stores were. And there are accounts, but written by people actually who are still alive. You have the Levantine suburbs of Bornova and Cordelio, which is home to the great Levantine dynasties. These people of European descent who'd settled in Smyrna some 2 centuries earlier. And here they lived enchanted lives in spectacular pleasure palaces surrounded by botanical gardens, getting on with their neighbours, the wealthy Greeks and Armenians, who'd also moved out to these leafy suburbs.
Many other Greeks who were not as wealthy. And Cosmopolitis, in his award-winning book Stouchadzifrangu, describes the ordinary lives of the Greeks in the poor neighborhoods. The Greeks in Smyrna The 19th century may have been the century of cosmopolitanism for Smyrna, but for most of the rest of the region it was also the era of rising nationalism. Greece, Bulgaria and Serbia began launching territorial claims against the Ottoman Empire, wishing to push the Ottomans out of the Balkans and divide Macedonia and Thrace among themselves. The Greeks had a bigger plan, the so-called Great Idea, which really consisted of
The simmering tensions between the Greeks and the Turks really exploded in 1913-1914 with the Balkan Wars, where the nations came head-to-head on the battlefield. And the upshot of this was enormous numbers of refugees, Turks from Greece, who were kicked out of Greece and had nowhere to go. Well, they had nowhere to go, but the Turkish government encouraged them to settle in the areas with the largest Greek populations in Asia Minor, namely all the villages and towns along the coast around Smyrna. And there's an amazing account by a French archaeologist, Félix Sartieu, who was working in the village of Old Fokya at the time, and he describes the refugees arriving, and they arrive with chetes, who are these armed, heavily armed, irregular forces. And Félix Sartieu saw everything that happened, and he was absolutely appalled, because the chetes came in with their guns, with their pistols.
And we would see the water and all the crowds and the people. And I remember my mother and my father.
In the summer of 1914, World War I broke out, and the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria.
In Greece, in 1917, Venizelos joins the Allied war cause, sending his troops into battle on the side of the Allies. Because he now knows the war is in its final stages, it's almost at an end, and with Turkey defeated by the Allied powers, he's awaiting the rich reward, which is the city of Smyrna. But correspondingly, on the other side, the Turks were horrified by what had happened. And in Constantinople, a remarkable lady, a member of the bourgeoisie named Halide Edip, gave public addresses to vast crowds saying that Smyrna had to be liberated from the Greeks. Halide Edip very quickly became a reviled figure amongst the British and Allied forces who were in the city at the time, and it wasn't long before she and her husband had to flee from the city, flee to the east, to the heartland of Anatolia. When Halide Edip arrived in eastern Anatolia, the first person that greeted her was a military official by the name of Mustafa Kemal, a rather brilliant general who'd fought with distinction in the First World War. Mustafa Kemal was The situation in Smyrna had never been rosier. The Greek army out into the countryside beyond the parameters of the city to try and quell the violence. And this is exactly what happened. With the encouragement of Venizelos, the Greek army moves out, attacks the Turks, and every time they meet the Turks, they defeat them. It seems so easy suddenly, and they push out further. But wherever they establish their front line, the Turks attack them again, and so they push out a little bit further. And it's quite extraordinary, the defeat of the Turks and being rolled back further into Anatolia, and they do remarkably well.
Meanwhile, in Greece, elections had taken place, and Venizelos had been defeated by his opponents, the pro-royalist party, who were opposed to the war. But King Constantine decided that he would in fact not stop the war, but instead continue pursuing the war, and in fact take over. He was, as the king, the leader of the army. And in the spring of 1921, he arrived in Smyrna, and there were scenes similar to the ones that had taken place just over 2 years earlier with the arrival of the Greek army. The population of Smyrna came out in the streets, waving its blue and white flags, welcoming the king. There was a new sense of
hence, in the summer of 1921, the largest expedition that the Greek army ever experienced in its modern history took place. The Greek army marched towards Ankara and gave their decisive battle in the river Sangarius in Greek, Sakarya in Turkish, where Kemal managed by the skin of his teeth to hold his position and repel the offensive.
What happened was, after the Turks showed that they could indeed confront the Greek army, the great powers began thinking to come to an agreement with Mustafa Kemal. And so Greece...
A woman in a small town outside of Smyrna that had visited Smyrna with her father a month and a half before the catastrophe was impressed by the dresses of the women in Smyrna, wearing organdy and beautiful colors and coordinated hats. But she also noted that
in August of 1922, the Greek-Turkish stalemate on the front was brought. By late August, the Greeks had started to retreat. As the Greek forces gradually moved further back towards Smyrna, they decided, in order to defend themselves, to employ a scorched earth policy, burning and destroying towns and villages.
By the 7th of September, the battleships of the Allied powers began to converge in the Bay of Smyrna. Rumours of the Greek defeat had now reached the Allied commands, and they wanted to take off their own nationals and the Levantine families. But for most of the citizens of Smyrna, the advance regiments of the Turkish cavalry riding into Smyrna. The first thing that he knew about was riding along the quayside. They had spotless uniforms and they had their sabres and they were shouting out, "Fear not, fear not!" But the Greeks and the Armenians were in a complete state of panic. People rushed into buildings, locked themselves into their shops, into their brasseries, into their bars. And the Turkish cavalry continued silently and peacefully along the quayside. They rode towards the Konak, the large building at the end of the quayside, and there they symbolically took down the Greek flag and hoisted the Turkish one. As dusk fell, troops began to converge from every different angle, from every different direction. And in their wake came the Chetty forces as well, the irregular forces, the undisciplined forces. At first all went well, they all began to come into the city, but then break into the houses, and the first noises of screams began as people began to be killed. Violence began to spread out, not just from Cordelio, but now in Bornova and in the city as well, in the Armenian and the Greek quarter. On Sunday, the 10th of September, at long last, Mustafa Kemal himself entered the city. He kept a very low profile, very few people saw him on that day, but he did do one significant thing.
Next thing, at night, we were in this boat, going to the Jambar, a very large boat.
By the morning, a funnel of smoke was pouring out of the Armenian quarter. And she saw worse than that. She saw a missionary, also happens to look outside, and she sees a second column of smoke. It's not long, perhaps 20 minutes, before these columns of smoke, and other ones as well, all link up into one tremendous black funnel of smoke, which is pouring out of the Armenian quarter. The wind by now is whipping up a gale. It's blowing in away from the Turkish quarter, right across the town. And as the wooden frameworks of these buildings caught fire and burned, so
the family was back in Izmir from Manisa when the city began to burn.
on board one of the warships in the bay were all the Levantine grandees who'd fled from Bornova and were now watching the fire. It was terrible for the refugees caught on the quayside. They had nowhere to go. At one end, at the northern end, the Turks had set up a machine gun post. They'd done the same at the southern end. There was no way they could get off the quayside because on the eastern side, on the town side, the flames were now 200 feet high and pouring out smoke and incredible heat. The only hope of escape was to jump into the sea. This is what they did. Numerous refugees jumped into the sea and they swam out desperately to the warships at anchor in the bay, hoping that they'd be able to. On board the American warship where Consul Horton was stationed, he could see the Turkish army willingly and knowingly destroying the great city of Smyrna. Consul Horton looked out across the screaming mass of humanity and he simply said, "The keenest impression I take away from Smyrna is the shame that I belong to the human race." The great powers could have done so much to intervene. They could have saved the lives of so many people, and yet they did absolutely nothing. Why? Because they knew that Mustafa Kemal had won this war, and in the hope of striking rich trading deals with him, they didn't want to be seen to be siding with Greeks and Armenians. They wanted trade over people's lives. People also point to the fact that on that very day, the wind direction changed dramatically. It swung round 180 degrees, so the wind was blowing from the Turkish quarter, which meant that the entire city would be consumed in flames, except for the Turkish quarter of the city. In some ways, the burning of Smyrna is simply a logical extension, a brutal one, but logical, to Kemal's policy of Turkey for the Turks. For 24 hours, the men and the officers on board the warships watched a scene of absolute horror unfolding on the quayside with the fire burning in the background. And after a while, they realized they couldn't watch anymore. They had to do something. And so too did the Admiral of the fleet. He decided something had to be done, and he began a rescue operation and began to pluck off the 500,000 men, women and children who were stuck on the quayside. The descriptions of the men wrote afterwards of what happened, what took place as they...
Now, one must say that initially the Turks refused to allow Greek ships enter the harbor, and that's what made it very difficult for the Greeks to evacuate people. So it wasn't entirely the fault of the Greek state. But it began to dawn on the minds of the nationalist Turks that this was an ideal way of getting rid of all these people, and therefore they began to be more and more amenable to the idea of evacuation.
The quayside, once a mass of 500,000 desperate people, finally was empty and lay silent. The spectre to this, the backdrop to this, was the city of Smyrna, the once glorious...
It was Smyrna that was ended with such horrific destruction.
When Gülfemiran was talking to me about the destruction, she said, in the new Turkish Republic, you couldn't have such a cosmopolitan city. Yet at the same time, she was conflicted inside, because she knew that with the destruction, her city was also being lost. She told,
I can't think of any other place in this earth, for the little I know, that can show a very, very little jewel example.